article is slightly different than the one he originally sent me, which I was originally going to present, but I think they're very similar. I'll send that one out too, but I think it's very, very similar. So let me pull up from my screen so you can actually see my notes, and I know how to do that, but I have to figure it out. Screen share, there we go. Okay. Oh, okay. So is everybody seeing my screen now?
I see it.
Okay, so I'm just gonna pull up a Word file. I don't have really extensive notes because it's just there's so much going on here. But for people who may watch this later, we're talking about the Metzinger and his phenomenal self-model. He calls it slightly different things at different times, and they're this review article in a slightly different chapter that Ken had sent me, I'll send that one out too, are pretty good summaries. I mean, they're not easy by any means. And then we were just mentioning that here's his latest book, it's like 2010, which is sort of more of a popular reading book, not just for philosophers. It's definitely worth reading. It's pretty good. And it's a condensed version of this. Is his whoops, sorry, this one is the newer one, The Ego Tunnel. And his original one, early 2000s, On Being No One, is his philosophy manifesto. And man, that's some hard going, but parts of it are definitely worth reading. So, you know, obviously the interest here is in consciousness, and that's really what his philosophy is, his philosophy of mind and trying to understand consciousness. But he's one of those philosophers that really tries to understand neuroscience, and so it makes it kind of interesting. So I want to talk about the positives first, because I really, when you sent me this article, I really, really got excited, and I thought this is the greatest thing, and read all this stuff. And then later on, then I'm thinking, well, yeah, there's some good things, but man, there's some, worries too. And so I want to talk about that too. But let me talk about the positive first. So the phenomenal self-model. Let me just briefly try to summarize this, where Metzinger is saying that, okay, so, and this is consciousness, this is how we feel like we have a body and we're centered. So he's saying, okay, well, this is a tool just like any other organ. So I like the fact he calls it like a virtual organ. Like somewhere there's a representation going on in the brain where it creates like a simulation of the person and the environment. And so this is like a step up between just like a simple organism that just has reflexes. If you really want to get complicated, you have to build this virtual model of the world in the brain, and then that lets you, do all the things we do about planning and things like that. But I think even more basic than that, it just lets you, model the different parts of the sensory homunculus and just, model different parts of the body. So that, that really makes a lot of sense, because we were talking about, consciousness and how to understand this from a neuroscience or psychology standpoint, and talking about how it, one of the things people talk about consciousness is like the global availability, where it's information that's globally available in the brain. And I remember Ken and I had this big conversation about, well, it's part of the story, but there, what else is going on? And that's when Ken brought up the Metzinger's work. So it makes a lot of sense. I mean, surely whatever's producing consciousness in the brain is also producing this model of the body, and I guess I'll use the word self. I'll explain that more later, but just creating this self model. And so that makes a lot of sense to me. And I also like the way you talked about the virtual organ, and he gets a lot of evolutionary arguments about how this self-model, the simulation could evolve, and all these things, which to me make a lot of sense. And it's a computational model, so it's it fits in with the computational functionalism and the computational theory of mind, and it's nothing wacky about it. It makes a lot of sense. So let me read some of my other positives. And well, I'm going to throw this out. This is kind of a philosophical claim here, or statement. So for every phenomenological state, or every feeling, I'm just going to say, experience that we have, it's pretty, I mean, most people agree that, okay, there's got to be some kind of neural correlate to that. For every, no matter, the feeling of understanding, the, whatever, however bizarre or existential experience you have, that's based in the brain. So there's got to be a neural correlate. So, we all have this experience of being self and being present in the world and all these things. So, clearly that's got to have a neural correlate. And so to me, that's why this kind of makes a lot of sense, because that sort of puts a lot of that together. So, oops, I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a minute and pause for a minute for a comment. So does that make sense so far, the positive stuff?
Sure does.
So I wanted to throw out one thing that I think is also important, that there are representations in the brain that are not conscious, and any theory of consciousness needs to clearly explain why those are not conscious. So I guess the classic example of this, or at least the example that I typically fall back on, is there are people that are blind because of damage to their ventral visual cortical stream, but they are able to grasp objects. They're able to avoid objects while walking across the room, and yet they have no phenomenal experience of seeing those objects and having that be the reason why their reach is actually well targeted. And so we've got this very complex visual representations in the dorsal visual stream that are supporting hand-eye coordination and are supporting movement across the room, etc. And yet those representations are unconscious to us. And one could say, okay, well, they're not globally available. That sounds reasonable. But one could also say, well, they're not globally available that incorporates them into a phenomenal self model. And I think that gives a much more satisfying explanation of what gets in consciousness and what doesn't get in consciousness.
Yeah, you're talking about blindsight. Yeah, that actually makes sense. That you need, instead of just saying, oh, it's not globally available, if you throw in the phenomenal self model, it's not part of the self model, so the person can't report it. So yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that's why this adds something to consciousness. I mean, the correlates.
If you could also say, so just to nail down on this, because so you're talking about the phenomenal self model, but there are probably very many ways that you can take that as maybe it's a generalization, maybe it's so how I've been taking it, how I've been reading his work, is to say that if you had a good enough map of the brain, you would be able to see certain frontal lobe regions that really do represent the intentionality relationship. That basically say, okay, here is one area of the brain in the visual system that says, I see an apple, and here's or apple, right? A visual percept of an apple. But there's another region of the brain that is saying, okay, I am modeling I am representing the fact that I see an apple. And these are two different things.
Okay, well, this probably gets to one of the issues I was going to bring up next. Is
Okay.
okay, how do you avoid the homunculus problem? You know, because you're modeling the self-model. So how is that different than saying, you know, it's easy to fall back on like the Cartesian theater and saying, okay, you've got this phenomenal self-model, but you sort of use that in the way that people have used the Cartesian theater, like there's some self that has this virtual reality, and you're, you know, modeling your senses and everything. And how do you avoid that? I guess I'm still not sure how he does it either, or if he does it with the phenomenal self model. So thoughts on that?
How he avoids, I'm sorry, one more time?
The homunculus, so how he avoids the little person in the brain with the phenomenal self model, because I think it's easy to fall into that, because you can say, okay, so why are okay, so you're, you know, you're crossing the street and you're looking at everything, and so your brain, your phenomenal self model is building this model of the world, and you're in it and everything.
I think one aspect of these these self models that is kind of disturbing, at least, is that how it gets rid of the homunculus is to say that the self-modeling part is just interpreting what the lion's share of the brain is doing, and so the decision to act is not in the self-model.
Mm-hmm.
The choice of your next word in a sentence is not in the self-model. The only thing that's in a self-model is a keeping track of what has been, what actions have been decided upon, and a misattribution, perhaps, or an attribution of that to an I, a central self.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I'm reading it, at least.
Yeah. I think that would be the ideal way, if you could put that together so that the phenomenal self-model is high enough that obviously, the way the brain works is sort of a lot of, bottom-up processing, so that you don't have some little person that decides, I'm going to, walk across the street right now. And so this phenomenal model is sort of deciding what you've decided and putting ownership to it. Because he talks about some of these disorders where, like these psychiatric disorders where people don't think they have ownership, like the strange Libyan arm is one of them, where the person's arm is moving kind of randomly and they don't have ownership to that. And so he's saying, okay, the phenomenal self model is broken, so it's not modeling that the person is controlling that. And also, the out of body experiences of people who feel like they don't have a body, or the neglect syndrome. So that part, I think that makes sense, and in that I think you can avoid the homunculus. But what about, the really crucial aspects of the self is that, somewhere in that model you have a, coherent, story or phenomenal feeling of being, continuing self with all these sort of continuing memories and just I don't know. I mean, how do you avoid some of those higher level things without someone in charge? Maybe, and although I don't think that someone is in charge, but I'm just, how do you do that without going back to, executive functioning, or well, who's the executive and where? I guess that's what I struggle with.
Yeah, one of the problems with Metzinger and et cetera is that there is a gulf between the level of description that they're talking about, and neuroscientific models of the brain. So if you were to ask what part of the brain made a decision? Let's come up with an example here. Let's say that you. So I like the split brain patient experiments. That I think that they're a reasonable proxy for this self model, because what the split brain patients experiments were showing is that there are times when one part of the brain makes a decision and another part of the brain has no access to that decision, and they decide to confabulate an explanation of it. So I guess one of the classic examples in the split brain patient is that the experimenter flashes up to the non-language hemisphere a command to get up and walk out of the room. You're familiar with this problem?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And the person gets up and starts to walk out of the room, and then the experimenter asks, "Why are you doing that?" And they say, well, gee, I just wanted to stretch my legs, or I wanted to get a drink, or something like that. They come up with an excuse.
Yeah, they confabulate, yeah.
They confabulate, and they believe that excuse. Or at least that's
half the brain, yeah.
all the literature says, and so I trust that that really is the case.
Mm-hmm.
So the phenomenal self model is basically saying that we are in that situation all the time. We just have a much tighter connection between the part of the brain that actually made the decision and the part that's interpreting it. And so usually we're coming up with very good interpretations of what the actual decision was based upon. But the decision-making circuitry is still essentially divorced from the self-modeling circuitry, and that skewers the homunculus right there, right?
Yeah.
Because it at the very least it splits it into two different domains, where one is really making the decision, but is making it in a fundamentally unconscious way, in a way that is very low level from a planning point of view, presumably, but could have some oversight from this self-modeling that might happen at a much longer time level, or maybe as a veto or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Daniel Dennett sort of, I think, has similar thoughts like that about how the highest level is interpreting and putting ownership and interpreting things that go on much deeper. So I actually agree with a lot of that, but I don't know. I'm just not convinced I can go all the way up. I mean, I'm not. I don't think there's anything magical in the brain. I just think that there might be. That might not get you all the way up to, the highest levels about, because decisions about, why I did something or not, I can buy that you're just confabulating and going for the best explanation or whatnot. But what about the sense of ownership to things, like phenomenologically, like this is, my arm or my hand or my thought, and just that higher level sense of identity, that sense of self. I mean, that it seems like there is some more literal, like he's talking about a virtual organ or virtual, reality, that maybe there is some. Well, he also talked about transparency, like it's like if you have, like naive realism would be just to say that, you're looking out on this bookshelf behind me, and that's what's there, as opposed to like the representational view where obviously your brain is creating an image and whatnot. So, and then he talked his big thing in Metzinger is this transparency, where it's the phenomenal model doesn't realize it's a model. I mean, he goes into that in detail and detail and detail. And,
yeah, except I mean, I really get frustrated sometimes when he says transparency, because it basically is just another way of saying the same thing that he's trying to explain.
yeah.
You know, it's saying, you know, well, gee, it doesn't feel like it's a representation because it's, you know, transparent. Well, what does transparent mean? It doesn't feel like it's a representation. It's a circle.
Yeah,
And
well,
that's
yeah.
true, but but he could say that in one sentence and then, you know,
Move on. Yeah.
well, I keep wanting him to go deeper into these things.
Well, exactly, because I think where you get to the, you know, he gets into a lot of the homunculus problem where, you know, part of it he's saying what, you know, you're saying, and that, you know, the highest level is confabulating and you know, certainly not responsible for, you know, doing the action and this and that. But then he talks, you know, and he gets into all the you know, the phenomenology of the self, and, you know, feeling like, you know, you have ownership of this, you know, emotions, or you know, like the out of body experience, which I think he does a good job of. You know, you've got this, you know, the brain is modeling your body to be within a certain amount of space, and if that sort of malfunctions, then you can have these out of body, you know, that's just your brain projecting, you know, a model in space, and you're creating some kind of model. But I don't know, I just have trouble with, you know, that there's something more going on, and I'm not talking about anything mysterious. I'm just like purely from a computational level that there is more complicated modeling going on.
So can I ask? Okay, so there's two levels of this. There's one level is to say you. So let me see if you agree with this.
Okay.
So you need something like a phenomenal self model to explain the outward signs of consciousness in an individual.
The yes, the behavior, yeah.
Okay, and I would and some of the subtleties of it as well. Like if he gives a bunch of examples, at least in his book, where, you know, you can you know, not own your thoughts, right? There's these situations where you have a thought, but it doesn't, you don't feel like that was your own thought.
Yeah, like thought insertions and all these things in like schizophrenic patients. Yeah.
And so things like that. I mean, I could imagine that would never happen, right? I could imagine, you know, like
conceive of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't conceive of it. You know, and neuroscience is filled with these, or neuropsychology or something. You know, it's filled with things like this where you could not even conceive of somebody that would not be able to recognize faces, but be able to draw them. You know,
and let me throw out just my favorite example, real quick, is like Anton syndrome, the ultimate, where somebody's blind, but they're not making it up, they're not lying, they're I guess it's confabulating, but they literally don't have access to the fact that they're blind. And, you know,
exactly,
it's impossible to conceive that.
Exactly, and yet these are data that are out there.
They're real. Yeah.
And these are data that are out there in showing that they're specifically talking about our phenomenal consciousness, in the sense of, at least in the sense of our, you know, us verbally relating this. And so to me, that at a very computational level, this seems to imply that there are two sets of buffers. You know,
Mm-hmm.
there's a buffer that is representing a visual percept, and then there's a buffer that it's not re-representing that visual percept, but it seems to be representing the attention to that other buffer. And I, one of the papers that you sent me, Mike, I think it was you, the Stanlis Dehaney paper, and some of the stuff that I read looking up from that. I mean, it seems like the real key to a lot of the consciousness representations are ones of attention. That there's a system in the brain that is doing a bunch of stuff. There's systems in the brain that are doing a bunch of stuff, and they're going to be doing that irrespective of the idea of your being conscious of them. And then there's an interpreter module of some sort that can direct attention onto different aspects of the brain so that it can say, I'm doing this because I saw this. Maybe it's wrong, but it's throwing those pointers down and allowing that to be incorporated into a declarative memory, or be a representation that can then be looked at by another module in the brain and say, oh, this is, there's some high-level mistake that just occurred. Let's derail this current operation.
And I think he mentions this briefly, page 30. The most prominent example, of course, is the human mirror system, part of the unconscious self model that resonates with self models of other agents in the environment through a complex process, right, of motor emulation or of embodied simulation. But, yeah. But then I don't know. I felt like that was the only part of the paper that really sort of brings that point up.
Yeah. So what is so Mike? What the guts of the paper of this paper? What would you what would you? Because I've got a whole bunch of his books swimming around in my mind.
Yeah.
And more importantly, I've got a bunch of what could be my bad interpretations of his stuff swimming around in my mind.
Well, I'm the same way, because I reread the article right before, just a couple of days ago, to presenting it, but I've still got all his books running around too. So I guess there's 2 points. I mean, number one is what we just talked about, is trying to computationally put this self model in, make sense of this. And I think the best part of it, what he does, is all those examples that we talked a little bit about, Anton syndrome and neglect, blind sight, and I think, a good philosopher has to look at those examples, and then you realize a lot of theories just don't work, because that is empirical fact. That's, you could go in and damage little parts of your brain and make things that you couldn't even conceive of, happen. And so, that's a hard task. I mean, I don't know, we talked a little bit about the homunculus and how you can avoid that. And I mean, I like it, a lot of his stuff, but I don't need to think about it a lot longer and, really, see how that works. That's the first part. And the second part is, I think, some more maybe different kind of philosophy, which I think I'm a little familiar with. So that's actually what I'm going to focus on now. So the first part is just, and just in that short paper, you can't, he makes a case just like what we talked about, how having a self model makes sense, and how, for some of these neurological syndromes, you have to have something like that, otherwise, you just can't explain it. So I think that's the first part. And then the second part is, okay, well, let's explain our goal. Backing up here is like, we want to explain consciousness. So that is the second part. How do we do about explaining, the hard problem and the deeper, because he specifically says this solves the hard problem, this solves, this makes a lot of things make sense in consciousness. So that's part 2 of the talk. And I'll go back to my handout. So does that make sense? Anything before I get to part 2? I don't want to say deeper philosophy, because honestly, this first steps is probably harder.
I'm interested in your take on this stuff.
All right, so here is part 2. I'm going to go to my screen again. And here is the further philosophy, because I don't want to say deeper, because I think the first part is at least as hard. So, all right, so I'm going to skip. All right, so here we got to talk about the hard problem a little bit of consciousness and ask the question. We all agree, we've all just talked about how this potentially could help with some of the computational questions about.
Oh, Mike?
Yeah.
So I'm not seeing your screen.
Whoops.
I can definitely see it.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
Well, can you see it now? I'll try it again. Can you see it?
Now I see it. Now I see it.
Okay. I mean, it's not super critical, but all right. So I guess so before I get to this, I need to start talking a little bit about the hard problem and all that stuff. So let me just read this. This is from a paper I just resubmitted on identity, which hopefully will get published, and I'd love to talk about it, because honestly, after I wrote it, I don't know if I even believe any of it, because it's just such a hard topic. But let me read this. So David Chalmers formulated the hard problem of consciousness as a challenge to reductive and eliminative explanations of consciousness. Chalmers argued that the easy problem of consciousness is explaining how the brain produces the behavior associated with consciousness. Executive function, all this complicated stuff that we seem to need consciousness for. And then the hard problem is to explain what consciousness is, why it exists, why is it correlated with the brain at all. And he illustrates the hard problem by asking us to imagine a world exactly like ours, with one important exception. All people are philosophical zombies. Philosophical zombies, unlike The Walking Dead, behave exactly like ordinary people, except they lack any inner life or conscious experience. Reductive explanations of consciousness cannot differentiate between these two worlds. The hard problem can be reduced to asking why are we not philosophical zombies? Why is the lights on at all? Because all the behavior could be perfectly explained without any inner life. Now here is something I've added, because I think maybe a better way to look at this is to reframe the problem and talk about first person and third person consciousness. And so initially you hear third person consciousness, well, that doesn't make any sense, because consciousness is experience, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's good to separate what we're talking about. So third person consciousness is the computational aspect, that things are globally available, where maybe there's a self model, all that stuff, that how I could explain, how Ken's brain works and why Ken behaves like he does. All I would need was third person consciousness. And the first person consciousness is just what it's like. Thomas Nagel probably put it better than anybody. What is it like to be a bat? How does it feel like from the inside, the qualia? Now, right off the bat, some people are going to say, well, I don't like where you're going. Daniel Dennett really tries to refute this step. But to me, I think this is pretty clear, and you've got to admit that neurons are not the same thing as the sensation of red. I mean, that we're talking about two different things, and any kind of identity theory, straight identity, is just not going to work. I mean, we're really talking about two very different things. And then if you look at it from another perspective, every person, we start out, all we have is this subjective first person perspective. And so science, everything we know is always filtered through this first person experience. So it's, I don't think you can in any way eliminate that. I just think that, it doesn't mean it's not part of science, it's not part of the universe. It's just, because I think it is. I mean, it's as natural as any other phenomenon is this experience. So, but I don't think it's helpful to just try to talk your way out of it. I mean, I think you have to acknowledge that. And then the tricky question is, okay, so it's hard enough to explain third-person consciousness. I mean, man, that is a huge computational problem. We've talked a little bit about that. But then, okay, but once you get there, then you have to ask the question, well, why is that associated with this inner, experience, this inner light at all? What is this just because that's the way it is in the universe? Is there some way to logically, could you ever figure this out? I mean, this is where you get into, the hard problem.
Yeah. So
come back.
Can I throw out a?
That, please do.
Okay. So my naive biased answer to this is to say that there seems to be a more and more perfect correlation between a set of representations in the brain that are representing what it is like to be. That's the self model. That's what I consider to be the self model. It's basically a representation of what it is like to be. So there's this. So the what you're calling the third person consciousness essentially requires that there is a set of representations in the brain that say what it is like to be that brain, and it loops around on itself, giving that whole system a way to represent to itself what it is like to be itself. Okay?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. And so from a third person point of view, if I wasn't a conscious person, let's say, and all I did was look at other people, maybe I would be under the impression that that they were all zombies in some sense, you know. But I would say, oh, but they have these representations of an inner life, of what it is like to be, and but then because I'm conscious and I have experiences and feelings, I can say, oh, those feelings are also very well correlated with this self-model representation, this representation of what it is like to be, and
so
therefore
you're going
must.
back to your first-person experience.
That's right. So from a first-person perspective, I say, gee, I know what it feels like to be me. From a third-person neuroscience perspective, we see all these other people's brains that are acting like me, acting as if they're conscious, but have enough peculiarities and enough stroke damage and enough people that are willing to have electrodes put into their brain, and to start really building up what the representations are in the brain that support the third party consciousness. And it doesn't seem like too much of a leap to say, gee, that must be the thing. It must be a so Chalmers at the end of the day, I think he says, look, there has to be some what does he call it? Identity. I don't remember what it's called, but he basically says there has to be some information. There's a
like
term,
informational isomorphism, kind of
something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
And how I look at it is, maybe that's true, but that is a very small isomorphism indeed, because it's just saying when a system has a representation of what it is like to be, that it can access, then it really is feeling like what it says it's like to be.
Well, let me throw out something to see if I understand you. So, what if? Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. That's one thing I totally forgot to bring up in the first part of this.
I mean, I'm really just trying to constrain what the zombie problem to a very specific. It's kind of like, I believe this. Maybe somebody that doesn't believe it would believe that, and how big is that difference in practicality?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think and like from the epistemology, the deciding if something is conscious. Yeah, I mean, we have every first person. We know we're conscious, and we study the brain. We understand all these correlates, and so yeah, I mean, you'd absolutely have to believe that other human brains are conscious and whatnot. But the real challenge, though, is, and obviously why we're all here, is then you say, okay, well, sure, nobody's going to argue that a human's not conscious, or a chimpanzee or whatever. But okay, well, let's throw out an upload. Let's throw out an AI that has a totally different architecture without a self model, and then we're sort of back to, okay, you can have behavior, you can have the Turing test, you can have all these things, and but is there the first person consciousness going on? Just extrapolating beyond what we know, and 99.99% sure that other people are conscious and that we're not being faked out, to even as something as simple, I think, as uploads are pretty straightforward because you could keep all the structure. So to me, that seems a good case for why it would be conscious. But what about a AI that is no self-model, but could pass the Turing test and seems totally different architecture?
Well, in that case, so okay. So by the way, I figured out what it was the double aspect theory of information.
Okay, yep.
That's what I was talking about. What Chalmers basically says, that you have to add to some theory of what he hypothesizes you'd have to add to a regular materialist theory.
Exactly. So you have the computation, you have the information going on in the brain, and you have the third person aspect, which is all the behavior and the physical correlates, and you have the first person aspect, which is the qualia, which is the consciousness that goes.
Yeah.
So he famously says, like, red is what it feels like to have the information going on in your brain about the red experience.
Yeah, and I mean that's a great example that should be dug into. But okay, so let me try to crystallize what I'm saying. So the a question like you just asked about the AI that didn't have a self model.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like that would have a very straightforward answer. There's nobody home. Because under the assumption that I'm making, and I think under the assumption that Metzinger is making, although maybe he's making some kind of bizarre everybody's a zombie argument. You never really know when this.
Yeah.
Him and Dennett, I agree. They kind of like
they wish-wash.
They like to dance on both sides of this issue.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, what I'm saying is, you got a self model that says what it's like to be, and the only question is really, does it take something more metaphysical, essentially, to say that information of what it is like to be actually is what it is like to be? And maybe a different way of putting this is to say, look, if we do open up the brain, if we do, in the next 100 years, figure out everything that we need to know about the brain on a third-person perspective, would you agree that we would have laid bare in representational, computational terms what it is like to be-ness that describes the organism's third-person consciousness?
Yes.
And okay, so under that assumption, would there be a perfect correlation between the inner experience and those representations? Maybe there's some epiphenomenon going on here or something, but correlation-wise, or would those miss something?
I think you would absolutely be able to 100% correlate. Let's say we knew we could figure out the brain and figure out the third person, how it works. Then I would think that you would have enough to, understand the neural correlates of consciousness, and where, I guess that meaning first person consciousness, where you could, absolutely say that this little, now I'm trying to think about how you put it before, modeling of an experience is the experience. I think, yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I don't think there's any mystery there.
Okay, because I mean, one of the reasons why I'm saying this is if we, from a brain preservation, mind uploading perspective, I can somehow agree why people would be uncomfortable at the philosophical level in terms of consciousness, but it seems like the third person aspect of consciousness, the best place to start addressing this is to say what parts of the brain, what mechanisms of the brain are supporting the third person aspect of consciousness. What parts of those, at a computational level, what is our best computational level understanding of those third person aspects of consciousness? And if we do a very good job of explaining those in relation to the existing scientific literature, and that comes down to Dehaney's work, like you were saying, and particular frontal lobe brain regions that are in charge of representing this and this and this, models of attention that are that can be tied back to the neurobiology, and to say, look, what those here's where those representations are occurring. These circuits that are supporting those representations are in the cortex, and the cortical, the way that the cortex represents visual information, auditory information, and higher level abstract information, and the way it learns things, all of those things should be similar in these other representational areas. It's just the visual system represents maybe a vertical edge, and this frontal area represents the intentionality relationship. But it's really just data structures. And so if we're confident in our model of representing how the visual cortex represents a vertical line, then we should be somewhat confident that it's the same type of a mechanism that is doing this other, different in kind but not in implementation, representational task in the self model.
Yeah, I agree, and I think if the best way to understand it is just to keep plowing through and understanding third-person consciousness, and then then you understand basically the information going on that is responsible for the self and consciousness, and it's just these structures. To me, that's the best case you could make, to say, so we upload this information, nothing changes. And this is where you get, I've sent out that paper, this would be a fun one to talk about too, is where you get into the dancing qualia argument of Chalmers, where I think that makes a really good case, the fact that, if you agree that third-person consciousness, what's going on in the brain, is responsible for, perfectly correlated with the first-person experience, and I mean, why is that true? I mean, I think you have to get into some kind of mystery, but that's true in physics. I mean, why is the wave function exist? What is the wave function? It's at some point, I don't know if those questions really ever have answers or even are that relevant if you can, build a bridge and build a computer. And the same, I think, is true with consciousness. If you understand third-person consciousness and you really know what's going on in the brain and how it produces it, and you transfer that to, different medium, then, then you've got the same consciousness. I mean, you can make a great case for that. And so what, just briefly, the dancing qualia is like you start to replace, with cochlear implants, you replace more and more of the brain, and there's no point where 51% of the neurons are replaced, where all of a sudden the lights go out and, there's no consciousness. I mean, that, that just doesn't make any kind of sense. And so,
and you're saying from a thought experiment point of view, you could switch that essentially instantaneously.
Exactly what you get the dancing. Yeah, you can switch it on and off and do all these things that I think show that, it's really.
Naveed, are you familiar with the dancing qualia argument?
No, I was just looking that up right now.
So I was actually, Mike. I think it would be worthwhile because I had not heard that until you had sent that around, and I'm actually astonished that Chalmers, of all people, came up with such a brilliant argument.
Yeah, I love that argument. Yeah. Well, so Naveed here, let me give you the shorter version. So, what and in the first and third person consciousness is I think it's so much easier way to put this to try to understand things. So what we're doing is we are replacing, not even replacing, we are every neuron in my brain, we are replicating the function with a nanobot or whatever, and so that we can turn off the neuron and turn on the nanobot, and the function is exactly the same.
Sure.
And so if you do that with one neuron, I mean, no one would argue that anything really unusual happens. So let's say you start that process and you slowly replace every neuron in the brain with a nanobot. And so, and this is where people who believe in like biological, like John Searle, and that there's something, the brain secretes consciousness or just some biological function, where this argument defeats their positions, because you slowly replace the neurons in the brain, and 10% at 20%, and this whole time, by definition, you do this so that the function is the same. You preserve the function so that the person is going to behave exactly the same. Every second you go through this process, you keep asking the person, are you still conscious? Are you sure you're still seeing red? You're really experiencing it. And of course, by the definition of the experiment, they're going to say, yes, I'm seeing red. I mean, nothing's changed. And so if you want to say there's something magical about consciousness in biology, then you'd have to say, well, when does it happen? Is it 51% of the neurons? 49%? And you're stuck with this arbitrary cutoff point where you have to sort of make this arbitrary thing. Well, okay, 50% of the neurons, you're no longer conscious, which so all of a sudden your inner life's going to fade out, which really doesn't make a lot of sense. And even worse then is the dancing qualia, where you replace 30% of neurons, let's say the neurons in the visual part of the brain that detects motion. And so you can turn on and off the neurons. And so according to somebody who believes that it's not the information, it's actually the matter or the biology, qualia, the experience dims in and out. So you see movement and then you don't, you flip the switch and you get qualia to dance from on and off.
Interesting.
Does that make sense? I mean,
yeah. I mean, I'd never heard that, but that's
I think, and I still think that's the best argument why uploading has to work. Once you get the third person details down. Now it's interesting because I was emailing Chalmers about this recently. He doesn't have as much faith as he used to because of things like Anton syndrome and the fact that. But I don't think that. I think that's not correct. I think you still should have confidence in the dancing qualia argument, but it's it's interesting because there's not a lot written about it. I mean, I really have dug through. No one's really ever refuted it, and so I just wanted to know if I missed something, and I don't think I have. I just think that.
I mean, the thing that would give me pause is memory.
Mm-hmm.
Because we know that we can have seriously confabulated memories.
Mm-hmm.
And so essentially a dancing qualia where, let's say you had turned off qualia for the last day, and then you turned it back on for the next day. The person is going to remember being conscious, but the memory of that is only due to episodic memories.
Yeah.
And so the fact that you can be wrong about episodic memories kind of says that you could probably be wrong, so wrong that you think you were conscious when you weren't conscious.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I see that. It's just like the problem, and this gets back to identity, where, we could have been created in the last 5 minutes, and everything else could have been, outside of the 3-second present moment where you can hold consciousness for about 3 seconds at most. Everything else is memory. And so, we could have all been created in 3 seconds, and there's no way to prove that, that's real.
Yeah. It seems like it seems like the consciousness question is cornered. Maybe it's not solved, but it's cornered.
Yeah. I agree. That's a good way to put it. It's cornered. Yeah, it's not solved, but it's like we don't need to solve it. We just need to convince people that, it's the information that matters, and that, you could get that, you could preserve that first of all, and then, then hopefully you can upload it. And everything we talk about too today, because we talk about consciousness, I think all that has a parallel with identity. We really haven't talked about identity, but everything we've said, you could ask to have the same parallel stuff with identity. And that's kind of what this paper's about. And if it does get published, or even if it doesn't, I mean, I definitely love to see to throw that out there too for discussion.
Because you could essentially have dancing identity.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Has anybody made that argument concrete? Or
no. Well,
did at the same time?
No, because the closest thing the title of my paper is like The Hard Problem of Identity, where I'm trying to make a parallel between, the same questions about identity are similar to consciousness, and that if you could, really capture the third person aspect, you would have a dual aspect theory of identity, just like you have a dual aspect of consciousness, so that if you preserve the third person information about the self, which is the phenomenal self model, all the memories, all that stuff, then we know, you've got to have the first person aspect that goes along with it, which is, which is identity, which is the self and the first person identity through time. And that's the argument I'm trying to make, but man, is that difficult.
So here's what I would love to see. And I've been looking around for this, but I think it probably just doesn't exist, but maybe it exists in a literature that I'm not seeing. I'm less interested in the third person versus first person debate, because I think that boils down to kind of a philosophical debate in the bad sense of the term. I'm interested in it, of course, but the thing that would really get me really fascinated, and this is the thing that made me interested in Metzinger in the first place, is that I want to understand the computational layout of this self model. I want to know how many buffers. I want to know what they're representing. I want to know if they're pointers.
Well, I agree, and I've been looking for that because it seems like he's really onto something. And you've got Bernie bars and all that, and that's a start. But I want, like you said, let's dig down, let's get the details, and that's why I'm so frustrated with a lot of the research in consciousness going to Tenodian integrated information theory, and Christoph Kopp buying into it. And to me, that's just like a waste of time. You're going from a magical formula that doesn't explain the third person consciousness. So how are you ever going to get to?
So I was reading some of Christoph Koch's papers on this, and it seems like one of the things that kind of made him split off is, and maybe I'm wrong about this, is there's an attention debate. There's a debate about whether you can be conscious of something without being attending to it, or vice versa. And he comes down on one side of it, and a whole bunch of other people come down on the other side of it. And I get the feeling that might be because Christoph Koch is a brilliant guy. I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt.
He is a brilliant guy.
Dismiss this self-model type of theories or anything like this. He is very down on the idea that self-modeling can explain the type of core consciousness that he's talking about.
Yeah, I mean, well, because he's kind of, I guess, in the minority of saying that, attention and consciousness can be separated. But of course, that brings up all kinds of how do you define it, because some people define consciousness as anything, global availability, and that gets into that. The experiment where you show 12 digits and you ask the person afterward what was in the third row. I forget the name of those experiments where you feel like you see the whole thing, and then afterward you can only name a couple, and if you ask to name a row, you can always name the different rows.
Sperling did them.
Yes, the Sperling. So those are the kind of experiments that people talk about in this debate about whether how much are you aware of it, and I think that's a sideline. I think this is how you define it. That's really not that important whether you believe one way or the other. So I don't know. I don't think that's the reason that Christoph is gone in with Tononi, because that's really honestly a kind of a minor point. However you make it, I don't think that's to me that's the way I read it. It's just that's not that huge. Part of it is definitional, that's my reading, and then I just hate to see the Allen Institute, and there's so much research, and people writing these papers about IIT, but it's like they're using it in such a vague way that like it's some kind of the fact that the brain is connected and that's important is some kind of new fascinating thing where because they're doing these studies where they're trying to predict consciousness in people who are like in a coma, locked-in syndrome, those kind of things. But these are all just empirical studies. You're looking at empirical correlates of EEGs and then finding someone who's conscious and finding someone who's not. And of course, if the more the brain is communicating, then the person is to be conscious. But it's so far separated from this theoretical, model that it's I don't know. I don't get it. I really don't understand because I wrote that paper and it just kind of got ignored. And then Tononi and Cog, I've just had another paper in Nature Neuroscience Reviews 2016 about IIT again. Here we go again. I mean, it's like the same arguments. It's this great journal.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I just think it's a big distraction because it's just missing the entire point of
it's not
computation.
It makes it seem like there's not. Their big selling point is supposedly that it's quantitative, but they're the only thing that they're really up against is computational models that have been around for for 40 years. And they're poo-pooing the computational models for something that is, essentially a big correlation of how much of the brain is active. It's very weird.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I just, I don't know. I guess time will tell. But to me, it just seems like the biggest distraction, and just obvious mistakes in this whole concept, but people keep. I mean, it's just taken off. It's like taken over entire departments of research now.
So is there any? You're preaching to the converted here.
I better stop the broadcast here now.
So if you find if you find any links, any references, any books that really dive in, because you see what I'm interested in, Metzinger.
I absolutely do. Yeah.
He goes right up to the edge to say, oh, there's going to be this set of representations in the brain, and they're going to represent this, and they're going to represent this, and they're going to represent this, and I feel like it's a big promissory note that must have there must have been some real research in the cognitive psychology literature, that really did try to say, gee, there's this type of a buffer that does this. The Dehaney stuff seemed to be moving a little bit in that direction.
That's the closest thing I've seen is that that group of research, which is to me like that has the most promise. You know, put everything you have, put the Allen Institute. If you want to understand consciousness, do that. You know, put your effort into understanding that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, you can't do that on a mouse.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I don't know. So you could even do, you know, I think you could do on pretty basic animal models. Well, yeah, I mean, it's, but, you know, obviously not the high level stuff, but, you know, for, you know, modeling, you know, how the mouse models its self get through the maze and all that stuff. I mean, I think some of that is still, you know, perfectly susceptible to the standard, you know, neuroscience kind of methods, even in animals.
Well, things like, yeah, I mean, there's some very fascinating questions that I think would, like what aspects of Clive Waring's consciousness are different from ours? Maybe it's an obvious, you know, but, you know, he doesn't have the type of memory that would allow a, any type of a lengthy self-model.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know. I just think that somebody that seriously said, look, we're going to take all of these neurological diseases, all the data from them, and we're going to try to really explain them on a base of on the basis of a set of representations in the brain that are being systematically destroyed or mixed up in some way. That you could start to sketch out something that is a real self model, and that would be, you know, that would start to predict other types of, and Metzinger kind of argues this, that if you started to sketch this out, you could predict some neurological cases that have not been at least understood as such. Maybe they haven't occurred, but maybe they're sitting out there and nobody has realized that they're out there because nobody made the periodic chart of the health model and figured out, oh, there's a missing neurological disorder right there.
Well, yeah, no, absolutely. Or you could just do, you know, transcranial magnetic stimulation, you know, turn off just totally different parts of the brain that have never been done and make these predictions. And yeah, I think that to me is the, you know, the way to go.
Cool.
Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm going to stop broadcasting. We can continue to talk for a minute, but I'm just going to close. This is the end of the session.